Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon or evening, depending on where you're joining us from across the world. Thank you for taking the time out of what we know are certainly very busy schedules to join us for an incredibly important presentation topic. My name is Jeff Hansen. By way of introduction, I'm a member of the Southern California chapter of YPO Gold, and I've got to tell you, I am absolutely thrilled to serve as day chair for this event today. I think we'd all acknowledge that the past year has been a strange one, and I think we'd all acknowledge that it's been one of the more universally challenging years for most, irrespective really as to what nation or even what continent we call as home. And I'd say that that's one of the many reasons that has really made me personally so passionate about the topic at hand today. As a brief background and going back really all the way to last February, early last year, I began tracking COVID very, very closely on an international basis. And I'd say that it was really out of professional necessity. And I say that because the company that my two business partners and I founded about a decade ago specializes in the acquisition and the management of healthcare-related real estate all over the country. In fact, out of the $4.5 billion in real estate that we manage today across the US and the United Kingdom, over $3 billion of that asset base is in the assisted living and in the skilled nursing sectors. And I don't have to tell you, this clearly represents, for obvious reasons, the highest risk category in a pandemic, hence the professional necessity. As early as last May, I began to learn of reports from across the world as to the use of ivermectin, a 40-year-old anti-parasitic generic drug readily available for the effective treatment and, even more interestingly, potential prevention of COVID. As early as last May, I began to watch the data, clinical data, come in internationally over a period of several months with increasingly strong indications. And it was precisely at that time that I watched Dr. Kory, who I didn't know at the time, give an impassioned and what was a second presentation to a subcommittee of the United States Senate that happened on December 8th. Just early last month, and he pleaded in that presentation with the National Institutes of Health to review the mountains of available data on ivermectin, again, that was pouring in and continues to pour in internationally. Dr. Kory's command of the impressive data and his passion in that presentation, as well as his own personal experience as an ICU doctor working the front lines, inspired me at a very, very deep level to act both personally and professionally. Dr. Kory and his colleagues, very esteemed colleagues, I might add, we'll hear about his team in a few minutes, directly from Dr. Kory. They have worked tirelessly. And when I say tirelessly, that is an infinite understatement since the outbreak of the pandemic, personally, to save the lives of many. And now with their operating from a much larger platform, the FLCCC Alliance, which you'll hear a lot about today, they're operating from a larger platform with global reach and with the ultimate goal to save millions of lives. And it's my honor to share this noble cause with all of you today. And with no further ado, Dr. Kory, please take it away.
All right. Well, thanks, Jeff. I really appreciate the introduction and obviously your support and this opportunity to talk about what we know of what we think is going to be a major impact on this pandemic. So I really appreciate this opportunity. So today, let's go over our history. So I want to talk about my group, which is the Frontline COVID-19 Critical Care Alliance. Our activities that have gone on and which are ongoing, which are pretty high level, and we're hoping that we're going to continue to make big impacts in how we handle this pandemic. And then really the topic at hand, which is this molecule or drug called ivermectin, well known to the world, and we believe it's going to have major impact going forward. And we're trying to disseminate the knowledge around this drug and its impacts. And for that, again, that's why I'm really appreciative of this opportunity. We'll go over how that message is spreading. We are seeing a groundswell. It's not only happening in this country, but around the world. And we are now in more and more contact with governmental agencies, both national and international. And so I'd like to end up with where we are with the evidence and where we should go, and maybe how this group can help. This is a rather august group that I'm speaking in front of, and I hope that there's a role we can all play in moving things forward. So first off, let's go over our role, the FLCCC Alliance. And the FLCCC Alliance starts with Dr. Paul Marik. I have to mention him. He is our sort of intellectual leader. We call him the big brain. He calls me the beauty or the brawn. But the five of us really got together early on, I would say informally. We're on the front lines. We're critical care docs. We're all quite well known in our field, and I just want to establish a little bit of that credibility. Each of us have been very well known internationally and nationally for at least one aspect of critical care. Dr. Marek, for instance, is a pioneer in the treatment of sepsis. I don't think there's anyone who knows more about the treatment of sepsis than Dr. Marek. I myself am an international expert, and I pioneered the field of critical care ultrasonography. I'm the senior editor of a textbook which is now in 7 languages and 2 editions. And then Dr. Maduri has had a really career. He's considered one of the pioneers in non-invasive ventilation, as well as corticosteroids and lung injury, which are really 2 of the main things that are keeping people alive in this disease. And then Dr. Verone as well, he and I share history of pioneering moderate therapeutic hypothermia. And then Jose Iglesias also has done a lot of work along with the rest of us on sepsis and the ascorbic acid. And then we have a number of people who've helped bring us together. Like I said, we started informally, but pretty soon people reached out to us and said, what's happening out there, you guys got to come up with a protocol. And they really had us focus on that. And that's, Jeff mentioned that we've been doing that for 9 months continuously, just reading everything and trying to figure out how best to treat this disease. And we've come up with a number of protocols. And let me talk about what we've done with that. So I kind of reviewed who we are, how we came together. And the first thing we did is we came up with actually a hospital treatment protocol back in early April. And when we first published it, we got a website, and we were just trying to pass along our expertise in good medical care. This testimony that Jeff mentioned, it actually wasn't my first time. I actually went out in front of the world in May, early May, at a time when all national and international healthcare societies were actually having very strong recommendations against the use of corticosteroids in this disease. And our group, we strongly disagree with that, not only based on Dr. Maduri's work, having analyzed all the data from the prior pandemics of SARS and MERS, but we knew it on the ground. We'd been in contact with clinicians on the front lines in New York City, in Italy, in China. And we saw how supportive care only was failing. And we tried to do something about that. Our protocol, which stands today, in fact, every part of our protocol that we came up with in March has essentially been continuously validated with more and more data, from anticoagulation to the steroids to the ascorbic acid. And I went before the Senate, and I basically mandated that it was critical that we use corticosteroids in this disease. And I got to tell you, that was not well received in the medical community. We were roundly discredited and dismissed until about 6 weeks later. So in June, the Oxford Recovery Trial results, I woke up one day and I find that the world discovered that corticosteroids were absolutely critical and they were life-saving. And so I just want to point that out, that our first protocol was validated in subsequent trials. And, we went out there with our recommendations and we were validated. And I believe we're going to be validated again today. So since then, we've been following the therapeutics. We had our protocol, and we've kind of evolved it a little bit. We've added a couple of things, or we've changed doses or dosing strategies. But when we were reviewing all of the other therapeutics, there's a whole slew of trials came out in October, and they were all negative, showing that they really weren't working. Most of the widely adopted therapies were not working. And then Dr. Marek actually started to see what we call a death, which he saw a few studies kind of line up, which had pretty dramatic trial results. And we hadn't seen that in all the therapeutics we'd reviewed. And so he gave a talk. He started talking to us. I'm always right behind Paul. And I just started reading. And I came across some papers which just totally transformed our insight into this therapy. And then we began writing a manuscript. And that manuscript has just recently passed peer review in actually a fairly prominent medical journal. The abstract is published online, and the full paper should be out within about a week to 10 days. But, it went through a pretty rigorous peer review, 3 rounds with some pretty high level peer reviewers. And they upheld our conclusions, which is that we believe that ivermectin should be and will be the standard of care in this disease. And so if you want to see that manuscript, the link is there. Now, since that time, so after October, we've come to find out, and now we're collaborating with the WHO, but the WHO and Unitaid, they hired an expert researcher to actually do what's called a systematic review and meta-analysis of ivermectin. And that Dr. Hill, he's actually been studying already went through and examined about 6 or 7 repurposed drugs, and none of them actually held up as being effective. They all either had mixed results or just were shown to be ineffective. And he's told me personally, when he started looking at the first trials, he became very intrigued. And I will tell you that since that time, they started looking at this late November. His team have done nothing but 24/7 research on all the randomized controlled treatment trials of ivermectin. So we're now seeing a lot of other efforts and folks and scientists from other agencies looking at this drug. And as some of you may know, I was again asked to give testimony. The reason why I was asked is my senator heard of us and our group and our protocol, and I think he was attracted to what we were trying to do from the beginning, which is we were trying to come up with expert, advice in how to treat this disease. And he again asked me to testify on my experience and my expertise. And I basically stated that we really need to look at ivermectin be a real contributor to solving this pandemic. And we basically had a call to action. We asked the NIH to review. And I'll tell you, that call was heard. And so we were really appreciative. The NIH actually invited us. We presented. I asked Dr. Hill from the UNAID and WHO, and we actually did a combined presentation because his data was actually at that point a lot deeper than ours because he was in personal communication with all the investigators around the world. And I essentially was arguing that, they really needed to stop with their recommendation. They were sitting on this recommendation against ivermectin in the use in the treatment of COVID-19 outside of a clinical trial. And that was preventing doctors across the world, because a lot of people look at the NIH and across the country from using one of the safest drugs known to man. And I thought it was inappropriate. They did listen to us. And they actually, since then, on January 14th, they updated their position. Now, although we were very satisfied that the FLCCC and our efforts, affected a change in a national health policy, we thought that was pretty significant. We were also kind of saddened because what they changed it to was a rather cautious neutral. They said there was insufficient evidence to recommend this drug, and that they felt that they give it really a neutral recommendation, which is you can't recommend for or against it. And I think that was a tragic missed opportunity to save lives and decrease case counts in this pandemic. And we've actually appealed to them. Their list of criticisms and their description of limitations of the evidence base we strongly disagreed with. And we wrote an open rebuttal letter to the NIH, and it's available at that link and on our website. And so you can see how we carefully went through their thoughts on the limitations. And then since that, since our manuscript's been accepted, it's also available on a preprint. Dr. Hill, just last week, he released his preliminary paper meta-analysis and showing these dramatic, statistically significant results, almost everything important we want to see in a drug in this disease. Massive reduction in mortality. You're talking about 75% absolute risk reduction in mortality, lower rates of hospitalization, faster time to clinical recovery, and these wickedly repetitive decreases in time to viral clearance and viral load. And then since that time, and now this could be a good or bad thing, depends how you look at it, but the Oxford University now is planning to do a national trial of ivermectin in outpatients in the UK. And although we're encouraged by their interest, and we think it's really important that they do study ivermectin, we do not agree with, as the FLCC, that a placebo-controlled trial is ethical at this point. The benefits have been proven life-saving in thousands of patients in a meta-analysis, and to give someone a placebo knowing what we know this drug can do, we feel is highly and unethically, it's inappropriate. And so we also wrote a letter advising them that they should change the design of their trial, not so that studied with a placebo. And then I will say we got a meeting canceled yesterday, but today we've been invited right after President Biden was inaugurated. We were asked to present to a member of their task force, and we're very happy to do so later on today. So that's the FLCC, what we've done, where we've come from, and hopefully where we're going. And really our mission, and I'll talk about this at the end, our mission is to make sure that ivermectin is the standard of care in the prevention and treatment of COVID-19. We think it's going to make a huge and historic impact in the outcomes around this disease. So if you guys don't know what ivermectin is, let's talk about it. So ivermectin, some might know it because it's a well-known anti-parasite. And what you should know about it, it's already historically important. It's already essentially eradicated a pandemic of parasitic diseases. And it had such a major impact on global health that the discoverers were awarded the Nobel Prize because it literally transformed the public health status overnight of many nations and continents across the world that endemic parasitic infections, some of them which cause blindness. So you had all these communities with high proportions of people who are blind. And that basically ended the blindness that you saw in those communities. And so it's a very common drug. It's been taken almost 4 billion times to date. It has a safety profile that's unparalleled. In fact, most of sub-Saharan Africa takes it on a daily basis. Now, why are we talking about an anti-parasite drug? Well, because around 10 years ago, scientists in the lab started seeing in these viral models in the lab that it was having really this pretty profound effectiveness in multiple viral models. And so it was showing this new set of properties, which are antiviral properties. And so naturally, when this pandemic broke out, it didn't take long for some scientists to say, hey, how does it do against SARS-CoV-2? And the first trial that came out of Monash University in Australia and then further beyond that into antiviral properties, and numerous studies since then have been done showing other antiviral properties. We're also discovering anti-inflammatory properties, which is really key to understanding how it works in the multiple phases of this disease. And so we really want a drug to go from the bench to the bedside. We are now seeing clinical trials results, and I sort of summarized and presented them briefly. But they really are reproducibly positive. And they're showing not only this profound impact in preventing transmission, meaning people who take it very actually develop the disease, but those who get sick, especially even early, they very quickly get better. Even late in the disease, you're seeing these reduced death rates. And so it's really striking. And we also have some data, which I will show, showing these epidemiologic impacts. The clinical trials evidence base is actually quite large at this point. We have 32 controlled trials, over 65 controlled trials. 20 of them are randomized controlled trials. Of those, 17 are in treatment, and 3 are in prophylaxis, and they have over 2,800 patients. And keep in mind, some of them are quite well designed, which is 6 blind, 1 single blind. And then we have a number of actually pretty well-designed observational control trials, and a number of them have been peer-reviewed, because these are all some criticisms of the trials. And I'll go over why I don't think those are significant criticisms. Now, my manuscript reviews all of the evidence, the controlled, the randomized, the epidemiologic. And I will say that Dr. Hill, his scope of work is only focusing on randomized control and only I do know that they are starting to work at the prophylaxis trials, but right now they're just looking at randomized controlled treatment trials. And there they have 17 randomized and over 2,100 patients. And he's identified 56 active trials. And again, we have results from 17, but very soon, more and more results are coming. And so we think that the active number of patients in these randomized controlled trials are soon going to exceed, 3,000 and 4,000 within the next weeks to months. And when we hit that level of what is called sufficient evidence, that's debatable. I actually think we've hit it already, but I would say the regulatory agencies are a little bit more conservative. But I would say sometime in the next weeks to month, we're going to have enough patients to make a definitive conclusion whether to adopt this not only nationally but internationally. So I'm just going to briefly give an overview. So this is a table from my manuscript, which just lists the prophylaxis or preventative trials, right? So when you take ivermectin, what is your chances of getting sick? And kind of 2 designs. One is where they immediately give ivermectin to anyone who tests positive. They go to the household members, family members, and they give ivermectin to anyone who lives in their household. And in those trials, they showed these dramatic reductions. So for instance, in this Schaumann trial, which just got published actually from Egypt, they saw that in the households that got ivermectin, only 7% developed symptoms versus 58%. The vast majority actually developed symptoms in those in the controls. And that was similarly shown in this another Egyptian trial, statistically significant reduction. Only 2% got sick and tested positive. And then there's all of these trials with healthcare workers, right? High risk, frontline, where they would take it either every week or every day for a period or even every month. And in each of those trials, dramatic reductions. And probably the most telling one, and this is the one which is just really kind of eye-popping, which is Carvalho in Argentina, who's the kind of the national expert at ivermectin and COVID-19. He took 1,200 patients, and 788 took weekly ivermectin for 10 weeks. Over that 10-week period, not one got sick. And when you look at the 407 controls who didn't take it, 58% got sick. And so, and that is actually a pretty consistent and very profound, large reduction as you look at each of these trials. And then speaking of sort of nursing homes and skilled nursing facilities, we found this study down here with Bernigo to be quite interesting. This was kind of like just a fortuitous happening where in a nursing home, there was an outbreak of scabies. And when you have scabies, everyone gets treated with ivermectin. So all the residents as well as the healthcare workers. And they noticed in that home that had an outbreak of scabies, nobody died and much less contracted COVID. They were able to control the outbreak and prevent deaths compared to regional nursing homes where they did not have anyone on ivermectin. And so we're seeing these consistent prophylaxis signals. Now, this is what's called a meta-analysis. So for those who aren't scientists, this is what I want you to look at. You see this number one. This is if the treatment effect estimate is of no utility, it doesn't help, doesn't hurt, it would be around 1. If it's harmful, it would be on this side where it would favor the control. If you look at this lineup of the point estimates of benefit, and you look at this is your odds ratio. So your odds of getting COVID, if you're on ivermectin, is less than 10%. And in some studies, it approaches 0, like the one that I mentioned. So you have a very, very low rate rivaling that of vaccines if you take ivermectin regularly in these prophylaxis trials. So, and the other thing is the consistency. You have to notice that. I'm someone who studies medicines and interventions throughout my life. And whenever you see a collection of trials, you oftentimes will see one here, and you see these conflicting or mixed results. Notice the consistency of these benefits and how large they are. These are not subtle and they're not close to no effect. They're actually all approaching dramatic effects. And so that's what's called a meta-analysis, which is considered one of the highest forms of medical evidence. Now we move to mild to moderate illness, right? So I just did the prophylaxis, and I'll tell you there's 6 randomized controlled trials. And amongst those, at least 1 or 2 will show the time to viral clearance significantly lower, the time to clinical recovery significantly lower, the amount of patients in the hospital, and even in a mild trial, they showed a statistically significant difference in mortality. The one that actually catches my eye, which it wouldn't catch most sort of what I would say scientists' eyes, because they tend to disregard case series, but Morgenstern and Dominican Republic, they very early on, and they've been in the news down there, they very early on noticed that they used ivermectin early and they just did not see what the rest of the world was describing, which is they saw patients getting better, none of them crashing into the hospital, and they were seeing very few deaths. And so they prospectively collected their experience with 2,688 patients. Again, 2,688 patients, 1 patient died. And only 16 required the hospital. And then of those they treated in the hospital, again, they had different outcomes, but those were late treatment. But in early treatment, I thought that was a really profound example of how effective this medicine is against this disease. This is important because this is what's showing the differences in viral clearance. The reason why that's important is that some people complain that, oh, these trials are small, they're done in foreign lands, there's all this bias. You can't bias viral clearance. If you're measuring the virus and it shows up in one arm and it doesn't in the other, that's like an unmistakable, profound result. And I will also say that this slide shows the effects in multi-day dosing, which is p-values show high degree of statistical significance in every single trial that uses multi-day. If I showed you the slide of the 8 trials that did single day, most of them also were statistically significant. And I just want you to know, for the scientists out there, when you see what's called a dose-response relationship, it's another pillar in the scientific support of the efficacy of a drug. There is no drug out there that we're using that is showing these kind of impacts on viral clearance, nor in a dose-response manner. And so this is really profound and must be recognized. Now, let's move to the hospital patients, right? I'm already kind of wowing everyone, I hope, because these results to me were really, like I said, eye-popping. It's what called Paul Marik's attention and my attention very early on. But I got to tell you, we thought this was an antiviral drug. Now, if you know anything about COVID, by the time you get to the hospital, the virus is not the problem. It's not really a viral pneumonia. It's actually a response to viral material. It's an inflammatory response. And so most of the patients in the hospital are ill with severe inflammation, yet ivermectin is working. And so we know now we've identified a number of different mechanisms of action against inflammation. And if you look at this, the evidence base in the hospital, 6 randomized controlled trials, 952 patients, the majority showing statistically significant reductions in mortality. There's no drug out there, including the vaccines, that have yet been shown to reduce mortality in the disease. So after all of the things we've tried, all of the things that we've investigated, and all of the things that have failed, I don't want to say at the 11th hour because it's not the 11th hour yet, but late in the game, we finally identified a medicine which is showing reproducible impacts on mortality.
And Dr. Kory, just as a time check, you're doing great. Yep. 24 minutes from the point at which you started the presentation, so we're doing well.
Perfect. Yeah, I think I'll finish up in 10. I'll get out of this clinical trials. Again, guys, now you guys are experts at what meta-analyses look like. This is on the time to clinical recovery, all consistent, all showing in favor of ivermectin. And then this one is the one that you just can't ignore. Look at the impacts on mortality. These are the observational trials, which some like to ignore. These are the randomized control trials. What's interesting is this is the point estimate of the observational trials above. This is the point estimate of the randomized. The randomized controlled trials are stronger than the observational. Please note the randomized controlled trials are showing a stronger effect than the observational, and it doesn't matter because all of them are showing consistent, reproducible, and large impacts on mortality. And you're showing about a 75% reduction in the chances of death with this drug in treatment in all phases of the disease. Now, I mean, I know I'm probably just, people have to say this is too good to be true. Maybe it is. I don't know. But I'm reporting the data. I'm a data-driven guy. And the FLCCC, we respond to data. And that's what we do. But we're now seeing reports, not only anecdotally, but you guys have all probably heard of long hauler. Even the patients surviving these terrible acute illnesses, they're leaving, often recovering. Many of them are outpatients, actually, who never required the hospital. But they just don't feel well. Some of them are actually disabled, can't go back to work. Poor concentration, undying fatigue, palpitations. When they get up, they feel dizzy. It can be really a disabling illness. It has been described in other viruses. And in this one, it's considered to be quite severe and quite common. But luckily, we're actually seeing some hope here is that in this one case series in Peru, again, another famous researcher there who's been studying ivermectin, he had patients who had persistent symptoms over about 4 weeks. And in those 33 patients, almost all reported total resolution of symptoms after 2 doses. And then he doubled the dose and he went out two more days and he was able to recover almost everybody. 94% felt like all their symptoms have resolved. And so also getting more anecdotal reports on that. Now, to finish with the clinical trials results, this is what's coming, right? So I told you the totals that were in those trials. And just so you guys have an idea, the recovery trial, which transformed the care of COVID overnight, which is from no use of corticosteroids to the use of corticosteroids, that trial had 6,000 patients in it. 4,000 were placebo, 2,000 were treatment. Right now, in our meta-analysis of just the randomized control trials, we have 2,100. So if you see these trials coming out in the next days to weeks, we're going to be well over 3,000 with almost 2,000 treated. I would have maintained that's enough of a data signal to adopt it, not only nationally, but internationally. So we got to see what the results of these coming, and they're coming soon. Now, we are not alone in this opinion. So Dr. Hill, who's made a career of studying medicines for the WHO and other national, international healthcare agencies, he is also as impressed with us with the consistent and reproducible data signals that are coming out. In fact, his last talk, which he gave, which is his personal interpretations, is he felt that the data signal right now basically mandates that we forewarn the world that this is coming. The data signals are going to hold up, and you got to get ready. We have to prepare. That's what's been done with all of the other therapies we've used. Governments around the world have pre-purchased vaccine doses even before efficacy was proven. We know that ivermectin is showing profound impact. The world and healthcare need to start preparing for this. In fact, if you look at the data statistically, when Dr. Andrew Hill was asked this by a very prominent scientist in a talk that he gave in South Africa, they asked what was the probability that his findings could be due to chance, to a random signal. And he said the probability that the impacts on survival is due to chance is 1 in 5,000. And the reason why I say that is, when is the evidence sufficient in a world that's cratering, where we have out of control case counts and deaths? The chance that this is not effective is 1 in 5,000 based on the data today. And this hyper conservatism of the scientific community, which I think is very well applied when you're dealing with expensive medicines and or dangerous medicines. Yes, we should have a higher threshold to adopt something, but on a safe medicine that's been around for decades, that's widely used, and that you can distribute to almost everyone in the world, to have such hyper conservatism seems grossly out of place to me. I'm going to show you guys. I just did the science part. I showed you all the trials from prophylaxis to early treatment to hospital. Now I want to bring it out of those trials and talk about the real world. And I think this to me is some of the most amazing and compelling evidence. And I want to thank our colleagues that have joined the Alliance. So Juan Chimie, he's a data analyst. He's from South America, from Colombia, and he heard early on in the pandemic these amazing reports of how effective ivermectin was in some communities and some friends that he had in South America. And he started looking at the areas of the world that started using it. And he did this amazing body of work where he really looked at not only news reports, and he followed all of the news reports and health agency reports of who was using ivermectin, when they were using it, and he was tracking outcomes from case counts and case fatality rates throughout many, many countries around the world. And I'm going to present some of his work, as well as Alan Cannell, who's a British engineer in Brazil, who noticed that in some of the cities in Brazil, he also saw these amazing impacts. And again, Trial Site News for bringing it to our attention, because Trial Site News is a website where they really try to post all developing scientific and trials outcomes. And they've been really diligent and meticulous about sharing all of the trials evidence, as well as the epidemiologic evidence of our colleagues. And then obviously Paul for getting us on the ivermectin. So let's just start with one of Juan Chimie's analyses. So this was in 8 states in Peru that started ivermectin distribution campaigns. If you look at the shaded area to the left, this is before ivermectin underwent widespread distribution for treatment. And you'll notice every shaded area coincides with the peak in case counts and oftentimes the peaks in deaths. And you'll see, so actually this is the deaths and this is the case counts. As soon as it starts being used, you see death rates plummet, going to almost pre-pandemic levels. Time after time, at different times throughout the pandemic, you'll see some started later, some started earlier, but it always correlated with the adoption of ivermectin. That's only one displayed differently, which is this. Graphs are in patients older than 60. So this is not confounded by a sudden increase in younger people getting sick. These are patients older than 60 that we all know have high mortality, and they did have high mortality until ivermectin came along. So if you look at this, early on in the pandemic, in April, May, and June, you had almost a 40 to 50% chance of dying if you were over 60 with COVID. Now you look at those states in Peru, you're talking about single to low double-digit chances of dying. The case fatality rates for older folks have plummeted to fractions of what they were in those 8 states. Based on that, and the Peru story is just fascinating because it's got some that the public health agencies done, and then some really sort of confusing things. But the health minister at that time got the military to start what's called MOT, Mega Operación Taita. And that's where they went through the countryside and they targeted the elderly and the most comorbid patients, and they prophylaxed them. They handed out and distributed ivermectin. If you look at these red bars, that's when they were deployed in all of these regions. These are different regions than those other states. This is only the elderly and the most risk challenged. And you can see here again that the case counts and death rates plummet after the distribution of ivermectin in prophylaxis. So this is a real world, almost what I call a natural experiment, showing what happens in the population. This is better than any clinical trial, and it's reproducible over many, many different regions. This is these are those 8 states I showed you before compared to Lima, and Lima did not use ivermectin. You can notice that the curves in Lima do not approximate what happened in those other 8 states. Similarly, Brazil, and I'm just going to go through these really quickly. You guys can look over these afterwards, but same thing in Brazil. 3 cities in Brazil, the mayors distributed widely to the city populations. And if you look at the decreases in those, they were almost oftentimes double to triple the decreases that were in neighboring cities in the region, which did not use ivermectin. This is, again, using the region, you see these drops in deaths in the regions that used widespread ivermectin compared to those that didn't. You either saw increases or minimal decreases. And so that's Brazil. So I showed you Peru. I showed you Brazil. Now let's talk about India. These are all the states in India. They are ranked in case counts per 100,000. So Delhi is the highest. Let's look at who's at the bottom, and let's talk about why they're at the bottom. Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, 2 states in northern India, which are massive. Uttar Pradesh, 237 million people live there, and Bihar is 124 million. Notice how the case counts per 100,000 are lowest. Now, they haven't always been lowest. It's not some, it's not driven by a mismeasurement or lack of testing. They were never this low. They've only been this low since, and let me show you. August 8th, India, widespread throughout the state of Uttar Pradesh. Again, I think it's actually 224 million now. They decided to adopt ivermectin. They dropped hydroxychloroquine. And if you see, starting in August, you see a little rise, a little lag, and then precipitous declines. Their death rates and case counts are now the lowest in India. Look at the bottom. This is using Google mobility data for the populational average. Notice how when they were in lockdown and they were sequestered, you start to see these activity in workplaces, parks, retail, recreation, and groceries and pharmacies. So all of this increased activity and mobility amongst the population, but yet what is happening? Decreases in deaths and case counts. Similarly, in Bihar, same thing. Increases in activity throughout society, yet dramatic decreases in case counts and deaths. And Bihar now claims that they adopted ivermectin before Uttar Pradesh. So there's a little competition going there in India. But either way, they seem to be doing very, very well by their citizens. And then look at New Delhi in comparison. New Delhi has this odd little sort of trajectory. Here, they actually were using favipiravir early on. They decided to get rid of it. It wasn't working. They adopted ivermectin, tocilizumab, and remdesivir. You see this precipitous drop in the daily deaths. And then it's decided, after reviewing, that there wasn't enough evidence to recommend ivermectin, so they removed it from the guideline. And what happened? A dramatic increase. And then this odd other thing happened where inspection teams started visiting all these private hospitals. And you know what they discovered? That the doctors were using ivermectin. And apparently the doctors didn't care about the violations because I think they kept using them because you're seeing this dramatic decrease. And I'm just going to move on here because I could do this all day long. Juan Chimier, Alan Cannell, numerous examples. This is another telling one, which is one state in Paraguay, Alto Parana, where the mayor, actually, the governor and his brother, both diabetic, in their 50s, overweight. They got COVID. They felt much better very quickly, the ivermectin, and they said, you know what? Everybody needs this. They distributed it throughout the entire state, and they basically claimed 6 weeks later that there was no more COVID in the hospital in that state compared to the other states in Paraguay. So again, repeatedly, Mexico, another example. Only the state in Chiapas adopted in August, and they also showed dramatic drops in case counts and deaths. Just showing, again, multiple regions, states. We're talking about India, South America, Mexico, Paraguay, Peru, again, repeatedly. So where are we now in the U.S.? So let's talk about that. We are starting to see a groundswell. It was already happening before the NIH upgraded their recommendation to neutral. The first is our colleague Joe Verone. He's part of the FLCCC. He actually adopted ivermectin early on in March, just empirically, just wanting to try to do something against the disease. And his mortality statistics are terrific compared to the national and international average. And he has very high acuity in his hospital. Our original report on our first protocol, he had 5.1% mortality for hospitalized patients. Now it's about 11. It's still far lower than national and international averages. Broward Health System, also Dr. Reiter, he published a paper on their experience in Broward County that got published in the major medical journal Chest. It was an observational retrospective trial, big study, almost 300 patients, massive reductions in mortality. He's used it throughout, and he says he thinks he's got about single-digit mortality for COVID in his hospital. And then more recently, Dr. Merrick gave a talk to Harvard, to Mass General. One of the intensivists reached out to Paul after and said, you know what? We saw saw the evidence and the papers on ivermectin. We adopted it in their ICU in December. And he's saying that in the first month, they saw that their ICU mortality dropped from 46 to 25. And now we're hearing more and more reports. So big telehealth operators. We have a big assisted living company in the southern U.S., which is adopted throughout their system. Multiple large centers, University of Tennessee Hospital, the Dayton, Ohio VA. And then worldwide in the last few weeks to month, we've had a number of adoptions in their national protocol. So not only the state of Chiapas, I think more are going to follow, the country of Belize, Macedonia, Venezuela, Panama, and then Peru again put it on their national guideline. So the way we think of it is that we think this is a really important second tool in attacking this pandemic. We think it's both a bridge to and a safety net for a vaccine campaign. Remember, the vaccines have some limitations that they have to overcome. Not only the availability, the broad distribution, but also some of the resistance. We know there are pockets of our society who don't trust and don't want the vaccine. We're hearing more and more surveys that a significant portion of different subsets are refusing to take the vaccine. There are some who can't get the vaccine. And also, we don't have the long-term data on the safety and efficacy. And so let's say, God forbid, that these vaccines don't hold up and don't achieve what they can, especially against some of these new strains. It looks like we're going to have something to help us out as a safety net and or help us while we wait for broad distribution, not only in this country, but you guys know worldwide, many nations are not going to be looking at the wide availability that we are here. So, Jeff, I'm probably down to my last couple of minutes here. There are criticisms of this data. So I'm going to tell you, I'm ready for any criticism because we've already replied to the NIH. So, and most of them are inaccurate. So people say, oh, the majority are not randomized. False. 20 of the 32 are. They have over 2,800 patients. Many of them are small. Also false. Don't define small. If it's statistically significant, it was big enough to find a benefit. And then I remind everyone that the highest form of medical evidence when you're evaluating a therapy is actually a meta-analysis of a collection of randomized controlled trials, not one individual trial. There's always can be a fault or a weakness with one large trial. So you always want to look at a collection, and that's what the database has right now. The majority are not observational. So some haven't been published and peer reviewed. I would say a lot of them have. And I want to remind everybody that every therapeutic used in this pandemic was adopted before peer review. Remdesivir, corticosteroids, monoclonal antibodies, convalescent plasma, even vaccines, they began even before a preprint version was. And then hydroxychloroquine and convalescent plasma were widely adopted before there was any clinical trials evidence. I'm going to tell you, ivermectin is unique. It's sitting on a large evidence base and it's not being adopted. And then the final one, which I almost refuse to consider, but I've heard this, that they try to dismiss the evidence base because most of the trials were performed abroad. And I literally had a committee tell me that they're not generalizable to our patients. So there's basically saying that an antiviral, anti-inflammatory medicine that works in Black and brown people abroad, foreigners, will not work in Americans. That is totally absurd and reveals just a horrific degree of, at best, ethnocentrism and at worst, racism. Now, this is our friend Chris Martinson, who's just a brilliant guy and one of the guys that joined our alliance, and he supported our work both in public and in private with guidance. But he would share with me this really cool Schopenhauer quote, which he said, all sort of discoveries pass through 3 stages. Whereas at first, when you come out with your discovery, you're generally ridiculed and dismissed, and then as you keep going, you're violently opposed. And then the third and final stage is where everyone dismisses you because obviously it was self-evident all along. And I will just tell you that we started to see our first examples of the third stage recently on social media. Some people were actually complaining that we were claiming to discover this when other people had before us. And so I was not offended. I took that as a good sign. It means that we're getting somewhere. Okay, so let's finish up. I talked about this before. The NIH had a strong recommendation against. We presented, and then on 14th, they upgraded it to this. So now it's actually a neutral recommendation. They're saying there's insufficient data to say for or against. But I will tell you, that's the same recommendation that is for monoclonal antibodies and convalescent plasma, both therapies that are ubiquitously used. Our rebuttal to why they should have had a stronger one is available there. And I will tell you, just this morning, Paul Marek and I, we've given many lectures in South Africa. There's a lot of movement in South Africa against their healthcare society. And guess what? Their main regulatory agency just this morning did the same. They actually had criminalized ivermectin, and this morning they moved it to a very similar one, which is they're allowing compassionate use. So we're getting somewhere, folks. We're just not where we need to be. The last thing I want to say is when you make up a guideline, what I'm really concerned about is that everyone's focusing on just the certainty of the evidence. There are a lot of other values and metrics that you need to use, and ivermectin scores fully on all of them. The fact that it actually produces a drop in mortality and avoids hospitalization, the cost compared to resources, how equitable it is. It's available to everyone, whereas the vaccines aren't, monoclonal antibodies aren't, and almost any stakeholder, except the cynics who might say the vaccine companies aren't, would be acceptable, and it's safe. The last thing is, although they did change their recommendation for treatment, we are still troubled in the FLCCC that their current recommendation for agents prophylaxing or preventing SARS-CoV is they recommend against the use of any agent. We disagree. I will tell you the FLCCC recommends for the use of ivermectin in the prevention of COVID-19. So final slide. If you guys haven't gotten this from my talk already, I am so blown away by this evidence base. And I think some of my colleagues, in fact, we called out Tess Laurie before, who's an expert researcher. She also is quite taken with the consistency and magnitude of benefits. In fact, when you look at those meta-analyses and you see the large magnitude impacts, for me, this makes it like akin to what penicillin was when it was discovered to treat bacterial infections. And just so you know, in World War II, it was widely deployed to treat infections without one randomized controlled trial. Here we are in 2021, and we seem to have an insatiable need for more and more randomized placebo-controlled trials. And I'm not sure what happened with the world with that issue, but this is a profound evidence base. So so let's just finish, because I'm so happy to have the opportunity to present before this organization. And I just want to call out again, so our mission is we just want to make sure that we can establish ivermectin as the standard of care. As physicians with experience using it, knowing, being expert at the evidence base, we know that this is a solution. And so with this organization, I'm so impressed with the organization and what Jeff described, but the way I've understood this organization is that it's a collection of business leaders and CEOs who manage the amount of resources that are managed. I've heard is that, globally, if you took every resource managed by this organization, it would rival about 30% of the world's GDP, making it like the third largest country in the world, the US and China. So this opportunity to talk to you all is beyond sort of moving to me. And so I ask you all upstanding, powerful citizens with broad centers of influence. Think about how you can prepare to protect everyone, starting with your family, your businesses, your employees, right? Those who are going to get sick, everyone you're in contact with who might have power, might have access to leverages of power, to get people to open their eyes, to understand that on a risk-benefit basis, one of the safest, cheapest, most accessible drugs known to man that's already won the Nobel Prize, and it's poised to do so again. And especially the press and media, we've had a lot of trouble getting what we think is fair and honest appraisal of the evidence that we're trying to put forth. And so we ask you all to get active and to try to support not only our mission, but also our work as an organization, and to carry that out. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be before you and present the data and ask you for that. And so the last thing I'll say is our website, flccc.net, a wealth of resources. We have a frequently asked questions section, which answers a lot of people's questions. For those who are trying to get prescriptions, we have a lot of telehealth providers listed on there that can help you. Keep in mind, it sometimes takes days for them to respond due to the demand. And so also, obviously, Jeff for bringing this all together, and you can email him for the slide deck, video recordings, or our papers. And so with that, thank you. Jeff, sorry if I went over.
Dr. Kory, I can't thank you enough for obviously what is certainly a very powerful presentation and relevant for everyone and every country across the globe in the middle of a global pandemic. The one thing that I'll mention in terms of the centers of influence, when I got involved with them, accepted a temporary board role because I was so compelled by the great work they're doing, how critical this is for our country and for the world. I just got in and started pulling the longest leverage levers available in my sphere to tap centers of influence. So there are 17 publicly traded healthcare REITs globally, all headquartered in the United States. And I haven't completed that process, but I've done Zoom calls systematically and individually with each of the CEOs of the publicly traded healthcare REITs that control $120 to $130 billion of US and Western European assets, a lot of which are skilled nursing and assisted living, as is the case with my company. And I'm really, as quickly as possible, the real estate guy exits stage left and puts the clinical experts and the scientists together. So I've served as a bridge for people that can really move the needle if they digest and understand this, as a bridge to the FLCCC Alliance. And I've done the same thing with all of our skilled nursing and assisted living operators, their CEOs, their head clinicians, their head of medical services, to really investigate the data, because we can transform, I'm convinced, the trajectory of this pandemic in the US and around the world if we begin adopting this protocol as a preventative and as an early treatment. We're already seeing it in one of our assisted living communities where they adopted this protocol about 10 days ago, and they're investigating it more deeply to run it through all 23 of their communities across 5 states in the US. So I add that just to help jog the mental creativity, the depth of the connections globally on this call cannot possibly be overstated. So I would encourage each and every one of you to think about how you can help in this process. We do have another 10 minutes or so for Q&A, and I'm sure that there will be robust Q&A. Hans Kierstad is asking about what the potential side effects are. By the way, before you answer that question, Dr. Kory, because we had so much difficulty in people not being disciplined in managing their own mute button, I'm afraid to actually allow that as an option. So why don't you folks just hit chat and put your questions in the chat box. And while you're answering questions, Doctor, I'll scroll and look for other objections or questions or concerns, and I'll feed them up to you. So the first one is from Hans Kierstad is, what are the potential side effects?
Yeah, so obviously all medicines have side effects. The side profile of ivermectin is considered to be generally related to the disease in which it's treated. So almost all the safety we have from treating parasitic diseases. So you might get transient like rashes or itchiness or fevers, but that's all generally considered to be from the disease itself as you're killing off the parasites and a little bit of an inflammatory reaction. The actual medicine itself, as far as isolated effects that are attributed to medicine, very, very hard to do. When you look at some of the descriptions, so for instance, the last time I saw the FDA website, they described this medicine as much more dangerous than it is. If you read papers and even the discoverers, it's considered quite safe. I've heard mentions of a worry of hepatitis. There are 2 cases of hepatitis in the literature, both resolved out of 4 billion doses. I don't even think you should mention hepatitis. And then seizures and coma, they've been described. They're extremely rare. Again, about 20 cases, which are actually complex to see whether it was the medicine or not, but really not an appreciable enough risk to worry about. Again, it's a very, very safe medicine. What we've seen, and in the trials, they really have not shown any increase in adverse effect, maybe a few more rashes than you would otherwise see, but generally a very well-tolerated medicine.
Dr. Kory, from one of our YPO Gold members in Southern California, David Frosch, I've lost his question. It came up earlier. I'm trying to find it, but it has something to do with the regions of the world, South America, Africa, where we're seeing tremendous impacts in the data as it relates to ivermectin, but he's mentioning that the populations there do have parasitic issues, and some physicians and practitioners are saying that one of the reasons that we may be seeing the trend is because the use of ivermectin is helping the population more generally as it relates to their parasite infection.
Yes, so we've heard that sort of theory. It's just not supported by the data. So unless someone, because you have to look at like some of those slides that I showed you, which is this rapid rise in excess deaths that correlated with the case counts of COVID. So unless you're telling me those excess deaths were from spikes in parasitic infections, I just don't see how that can be tenable. And the other thing is those same dynamics that we're seeing in other areas as well that aren't endemic with parasites. And so the idea that killing off the parasites suddenly reduces your mortality, or there's some synergy between parasites and COVID that make it worse. So if you get rid of the parasites, it's just not held up by the data. If you look at the American data, the US data, look at Brockton, Massachusetts, just that little hospital, right? There's no parasites in Brockton, Massachusetts, and in Florida as well. We're seeing it so reproducible from so many areas where there's no parasites that are endemic that I feel that that's not really a very well supported theory.
Okay, and Dr. Kory, people are asking about dosing for both prophylaxis, pre and post exposure, as well as treatment if you get infected. Look, out of respect for time, I'd refer everybody to the flccc.net website. Look at the iMask Plus, including ivermectin protocol, and for hospitalized patients, look at the MATH Plus protocol. And let's see, other questions. They're coming in so fast, it's hard to. Are there any potential issues with mid to long term prophylactic use?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So here's the deal with that. We will admit that there is no precedent for taking this medicine at the frequency we propose in prophylaxis, right? So although there are regular parasite prophylaxis or eradication programs throughout Africa, you're talking about 2 doses a year. So I want to state that we don't have what's called long-term safety data. We do have from Dr. Carvalho in Argentina, he has a huge group of healthcare workers who took a dose a week for 10 weeks, then a 4-month holiday, and now they're on a second round of a dose a week for 10 weeks. There were no side effects that he's reported there from long-term dosing. So we don't think that there's a harm to long-term dose. It's a very safe medicine, but we will admit we don't have sufficient long-term data. But there's so much research going on in this, and as we get more and more experiences, I mean, I've known people who've been prophylaxing since March with daily or every 2-week dosing, and without any complaints. In fact, a significant number of people that we're increasingly meeting who've been prophylaxing for a while. So if we get a signal of harm or anything untoward, we'll be the first to share it.
Yeah, and Doctor, I saw it earlier. Hopefully, I'm paraphrasing correctly, but it has something to do with dosing. But it's an important topic that I know you've covered before. With respect to the prophylactic utilization, the reality is you get set and it builds in your system, right? It builds in your system, and so continuing to prophylax for a long period of time, it after 10 or 12 weeks of taking it weekly. 1 dose weekly, don't you just take it once a month? And the other,
so that's again, I want to admit what we think we know and what we don't know. So Paul and I and the group spent a lot of time figuring out our prophylaxis protocol. We went back and forth. We've evolved it a few times. Currently, we do loading doses, so day 1, day 3, and then every 2 weeks. Now, other protocols are doing it every week. So, for instance, Carvalho does it every week for 10 weeks, and then he takes a 4-month holiday because there is a buildup of deposition in tissues. We favored, for just simplicity and for the longer term, to just do it every 2 weeks. It has a long half-life. And so based on the fact that even monthly, we saw really good effects. And so I got to tell you, we don't know the perfect answer. But we think it's the most pragmatic, not only in terms of efficacy, but also in resource use. And I do want to say this, Jeff, is that although we are recommending that it's effective as a preventative as well as treatment, when we talk about the resources and the supplies, we do have to mention that we really need it for the patients who are currently sick now. You know, they need to be prioritized. And so I would hate for supplies to run out and be deprived of those who are actively ill.
Another question just came in a couple minutes ago. How can you get the attention of the Biden COVID-19 task force, get their attention?
Well, we're meeting with them today. The FLCCC was invited. We did get word through some communications through our network. Michelle Rabin, she's been a great advocate for our work. She was able to make contact. And we were told weeks ago that they were looking at ivermectin. They were aware of ivermectin. And again, we were invited to a meeting on the day that President Biden was inaugurated, and we look forward to making our case.
Okay, mechanisms of action. There's a physician on that wants to understand the mechanisms of action before prescribing. And then there is also a second question. Is there any contraindication as it relates to pregnant women?
Yes. Okay. The first one, I think it's best served for this audience to refer the physician to our paper where we explore multiple mechanisms of action. We think there's probably 3 or 4 antiviral mechanisms and at least 2 to 3 anti-inflammatory mechanisms. And in our manuscript, we very well reference and we really go through all of those. So I think that physician would be best served reading that section because it's probably too scientific for the audience. Now, pregnant women. That would be a really difficult risk-benefit analysis. I'll tell you why. In animal studies, there is some signals of teratogenicity, which is a fancy word to say that there have been birth defects seen in animal studies. So we don't know, and no one ever really knows the safety of any pregnant man because we don't test it on pregnant women, right? So there's always caution around that. So I would say pregnant women certainly shouldn't prophylax. And even women who are trying to get pregnant or think they might be pregnant shouldn't be prophylaxing if that is their main concern, right? It's everything's risk benefit. Now, if you're ill and you're in the first trimester, that's a risk benefit decision that you need to make with your physician. I would say if you're becoming ill or getting worse, that would be a time where I would strongly consider treatment 1 dose. But we don't have full safety data around pregnant women.
Hey, Pierre, I just want an internal bet. You'll like the next one. Is there any contraindication with alcohol?
The answer is no. The answer is no. Plenty of people around the world. There are 4 billion doses, and we've never really heard of Yeah, there's just no signal that there's a contraindication with alcohol. Maybe I should tell them that there is, so they stop drinking. But we don't know of any. And also the other thing on that, though, Jeff, more importantly, is another mistruth that is propagated is that you can't give it to patients with liver disease. Totally false. There's no dose modification required on liver disease, and it doesn't cause liver injury. There's only been 2 cases in the history of hepatitis with this. And so, because we do hear, oh, he's got liver disease, we can't give it to him. That is simply not true.
One of the questions is, could you repeat the name of the Broward doctor that is studying ivermectin? I wouldn't mention names, but he's the head of the ICU that, and in 30 days using ivermectin, cut his mortality rate. Again, this is not general hospitalized COVID patients. This is COVID patients in the ICU, cut it down from 45 to 25%. And now the hospitalists, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Sierra, are investigating the data for more broader use in the hospital setting.
So that was at Brockton in Massachusetts that they recently used it. The Broward County, which is Dr. Reiter, which is Rajter, he published on his experience, and they've been using it throughout the pandemic to very good effect with very low hospital mortality. And I don't have to go to the Brockton doctor.
And we appreciate that you know that the majority of those on the call are CEOs. We do have some entrepreneurial scientists, no doubt, internationally within YPO. I know of 2 that were actually on the call. So for their benefit, can you mention the depth of the slides that you included in your addendum that would more specifically, target them?
Yeah. So there we basically show these basically the dose responses in a number of viral models. So against Zika, dengue, West Nile. So there's a bunch of viral models where ivermectin has been maybe a broad antiviral. It probably is not just COVID that it works against. And then also some of the anti-inflammatory models, which also are showing dose responses, which is higher the doses, the lower the inflammatory markers you're measuring in a number of different sort of sepsis models. And so we have a few slides on that. And then most importantly, and Jeff, I'm going to ask this question because no one's asked it. Maybe it's more on the science, but I just want to recognize that throughout the world, people have dismissed ivermectin since the beginning based on the following flawed theory, is that the first cell culture model purported to use such high doses that most of the world thought ivermectin could never be an antiviral because you'd need to use 100 times the dose. That has been disproven. It's not only disproven by the clinical data that I showed you today, but in a numerous other cell models or mechanism of action studies, which show that you don't need such high doses. And then the Australian group recently repeated that study using lung cells. And they actually showed that the concentration required to block viral replication in normal lung tissue is easily achievable with a standard dose. So this concerns that you need 100 times the dose has been thoroughly disproven.
Yeah, 3 doctors in sequence within the last 3 minutes have all asked the same thing, and I thought you addressed it, but they need to clearly understand the mechanisms of action. Can you go into that a little more deeply and maybe even include what Andrew Hill's findings indicated?
Yeah, so it's clearly working as antiviral. So if you look at Andrew Hill's data, which is only randomized controlled trials, when he looks at single-day dosing and you look at the time to viral clearance, where you can't measure any virus on PCR, the majority are statistically significant positive. That's single-day dosing. When you go to 2-day dosing, all of them show dramatic reductions in the time to viral clearance. So we have like clear objective data that it's working as an antiviral. Now, what is that exact mechanism, which is the predominant one? We don't know. We think the important one, which is from the one from Kaeli and Wabsite, is probably the least contributory. We think it binds to the spike protein. That's what we think is it's such a good blocking agent. It blocks entry, and we also think it blocks replication by interrupting the formation of critical proteins. And so, yeah, I mean, I would say again, look at our manuscript as we go through several of those. And the last thing I would say is it's well known that cell culture models and humans are totally different. The doses are just not the same. Cell culture models does not have an immune system, nor do they have interferons being produced in those cells. And so the idea that you need a lower dose in humans is not a surprise.
There are 5 or 6 people that have typed in asking me to repeat the email address to send you requests for the slide deck and the video recording to. It's just easier to refer you to my company website, American Healthcare Investors, and you can dial 202 is my extension, and just leave me a voicemail with your email address. It's jhansen@ahinvestors.com. American Healthcare Investors, you can reach me through the website. Let me see if there are any.
Jeff, I saw a couple that I think are good. So I finally got to see the questions. So one, which is important, is will taking ivermectin interfere with the vaccines? And what I can say is, again, that's we've consulted with some vaccine experts, and they don't believe that there's any interaction. It should not limit or mitigate the efficacy of the vaccine. In fact, if you do prophylax, we're recommending that you take it until you a little after you take that second shot, because you're not protected until that point. And so we don't believe that that would interfere. And then someone else asked, will it prevent, if you get sick, will it prevent you from transmitting to others? And that's exactly what that prophylactic data shows, especially when you see the patients who test positive and you give it, if you treat them early, it seems that it probably reduces transmission as well as reception. So it's sort of an answer of both. If you treat everyone around you, that's probably the best protection. But the clearance, the viral clearance, even Andrew Hill says this, the fact that you're going to viral clearance so much quicker, it reduces the risk of transmission, or at least the time of transmission, theoretically. Again, we need more data on a few of these aspects. Also, since this is such a great opportunity, Jeff, and your audience is so, again, so impactful and have such a broad circle of influence and resources, I would love to, again, that, we need the support for our organization and our mission. And so anything that can be done to spread this message or help us spread it.
A couple of additional questions that I think are good. Are there any considerations or risks associated with ivermectin use in kids? And that in this particular instance, they say specifically as it relates to high schoolers and college students. Maybe you can reference the broad swath of 60% of sub-Saharan Africa takes it annually.
So here's the thing about that. So the safety of treatment shouldn't really be questioned. You could treat a child who's sick with COVID. The question on prophylaxis, we in our protocol, we recommend prophylaxing high-risk individuals and or post-exposure. Children are generally quite low risk. I don't know that I would want to give that to, the risk benefit there of treating a child prophylactically is not clear to me. So we don't necessarily recommend that, but that could be a decision with your physician or provider. But for treatment, it should be quite safe to treat young people.
And I know that, by the way, back to the earlier question regarding interaction or contraindications as it relates to the vaccines. I know the leader of the FLCCC, your colleague, Dr. Paul Merrick, received both the vaccine and prophylaxis on ivermectin as well. Another question is, why is the government so slow to respond and to adopt? That's the question.
So those are the ones where you just, I'm going to give you my thoughts. Getting into the head of all of the little cogs of the government is very hard. But being a physician and seeing how change in medicine occurs, what was happening early on in the pandemic, I think, is working against us. And so the best I can say is that there is, unfortunately, at this time point in the pandemic, an extreme skepticism and conservatism towards adopting a new therapy, because almost everyone that has been adopted has failed, or the evidence has not supported its use. The exuberant adoption of hydroxychloroquine, a drug which has some impacts if you give it early, but generally not very potent. That was widely used in all aspects of the disease, and it largely failed at doing what it was supposed to do. Monoclonal antibodies have near nil impact. Remdesivir is really not the drug that everyone was hoping it would be. And convalescent plasma we never thought would work. So there's been so many things that got EUAs and tacit approvals that I think now everyone's afraid of making a mistake. And I cannot describe a worse time for that conservatism to happen at a time, especially in this country where we're losing control of the pandemic. We need something else to backstop. The vaccines are there. They're coming. I think they're helping, but we don't know how much they're going to help. And there's still going to be a time. And so, again, I keep arguing for what's called a risk-benefit analysis in a pandemic. The safety is unparalleled. The cost is unparalleled. And so given the risks of this uncontrolled spread, blood and all the deaths and the hospitals filling. Come on, I'm a doctor. My colleagues are getting burnt out. They're getting overwhelmed. We got to offload the hospitals, and not for their sake, for the patient's sake. And so you asked me, why aren't they adopting it? That's the most generous answer I can give, is that they're afraid of making another mistake. And I think that's going to change. I'm going to tell you guys, my prediction is it will be the standard of care. When it happens, it's not going to be when I think it should happen, but it's going to happen. It's going to happen.
How many? Maybe just a couple more, and then we can conclude. We still have 80% of the people that were originally on. So, again, good job. After how many doses of ivermectin are you actually protected?
I mean, I think within the first dose, because remember, we do 2 loading doses, so you should have a pretty decent concentration within the first day or two, and then you just maintain them. In Dr. Carvalho's study where he did it weekly, he showed in 2 studies perfect protection in healthcare workers. We probably the reduction is probably your chances are very low, but not zero is what we think. But we think it should be active very early on after taking it. And I'll tell you why. I mean, in those post-exposure prophylaxis where someone tested positive in the household and then the household got it, very few of them got it. So I think those first doses were protective against their household member.
What's the half-life of the drug, and what constitutes a loading dose? And I'd encourage you, for the lay people on the call, to mention the body weight divided by 11. It's a lot easier than
right. So it's a dose adjusted, right? So it's 0.2 milligrams per kilogram, or your body weight in pounds divided by 11 is how many milligrams you should take. And a loading dose is essentially, we give 2 doses 48 hours apart. The half-life is anywhere from about 18 to 72 hours. So it's considered a quite long half-life. And that's also why we dose it every 2 weeks. And the other thing important for the half-life is that that's kind of the serum. We know it deposits in the tissues. So for instance, in the lung and in the fatty tissue, especially in the lung, it's found up to 17 days later after a dose. And so that's why we're dosing it the way we're doing. And so we put a lot of thought into that.
Okay. And why don't you, in terms of, we're talking about dosing, can you talk a little bit about the margin of safety for the drug? I think there are only 1,688 indications of potential side effect globally over 4 decades, with the central repository that the World Health Organization has up over a 40-year period, 3.7 billion doses. So can you talk a little bit about that, and as it relates to margin of safety and the level of dosing that we're talking about for both prophylaxis and treatment?
Yeah, so let's stick with standard dosing first. So standard dosing throughout the world for parasites is generally 1 dose of 0.2 milligrams per kilogram. So the safety data historically on 4 billion doses is based on that 1 dose. And when you talk about side effects, right, all medicines have side effects. I think none of us want any side effects, but we really should talk about the serious ones, not the ones that are transient. Again, most of them that I've mentioned are considered to be part of the disease they're treated. So the big ones that keep coming up are things like seizures or coma. So there have been cases of unconsciousness or altered consciousness. So there is a worry if someone has a non-intact blood-brain barrier. So if someone has an acute neurologic injury or inflammation, which some of these parasitic diseases has, it's thought that you are at risk at some neurologic complications. But again, it's exceedingly rare. And so in the very sick or someone with some acute neurologic inflammatory injury or infection, I would worry about repeated dosing. Yeah. Go ahead, John. And then seizures, I just have not heard enough about seizures. It's not clear that it was ever from ivermectin. It does not lower the seizure threshold. If it did, we would see that as a very common one. There is a mutation most found in collie dogs. So Paul and I sometimes joke, if you're a collie dog, you probably shouldn't take ivermectin because they actually do get neurologic problems. But that mutation that occurs in collie dog, there's only been 1 report in a human who actually did get sick from ivermectin. But 1 human out of 4 billion is not really something that we should be or can worry about on a therapeutic level. Now, the higher dosing that someone was asking about, that's all things that we're looking to see. You know, some of the trials, again, small in the sense that they're not billions of patients, but they've been using 0.4 milligrams. We even had one that used 0.6 for up to 5 days. And so as we go forward, I think more studies will be done at varying dose ranges, and we'll see if the adverse effects increase or are more common. So far, we have not seen that signal, but I will admit we need to know more.
And somebody asks, should someone that's relatively healthy take ivermectin? And also, what's more effective, ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine?
Oh, ivermectin by far on the second one. So you can't even compare the two drugs. It's already been compared. In fact, one of the really good trials actually had hydroxychloroquine in the control group, and there was a massive reduction in mortality with ivermectin. So if you look at the talk with the meta-analyses, if you look at a meta-analysis of hydroxychloroquine, the studies are all over the place. The randomized controlled trials all show no effect. The observational generally showed effect. It's all about the timing with hydroxychloroquine. I just don't feel it's a very potent medicine. So
there's a lot. I'm sorry, Pierre. There's a lot of dialogue regarding the veterinary grade ivermectin, and someone is responding. It looks like a physician saying, by definition, the liquid form must be pure. I mean, clearly, we got to be careful about this type of dialogue.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, remember that's an injectable one, and no one should ever inject it. But I do know I have been told that it's pure. But we can't recommend animal grade ivermectin as the FLCCC. We don't have the safety data on that, and we worry about how people. We really want this under the care of a physician. We're not aware of toxicity data, but again, we can't really recommend that, and so that's why we want our healthcare leaders to show leadership. We want them to work with our pharmaceutical companies like Edenbridge, and we really do think there needs to be a Defense Production Act, so we all get high quality and appropriate supplies of this drug as needed.
From Robert Sweet, Doctor Jeff, for us lay people, can you ask about the legalities of its use in the U.S. before in EUA and emergency use authorizations? Are doctors legally able to prescribe it for this off-label use?
So absolutely they have, and I've been prescribing it for months. I mean, when you don't have, so first of all, it's an FDA-approved drug for parasitic infections. When you use it for a different indication, it's called off-label use. Off-label use is entirely appropriate. Every physician does it every day with numbers of medicines. So it's okay to use an FDA-approved drug for one indication with another. It's not illegal. It's nothing to be sued for, as long as you're aware of the drug, its efficacy, and the data in support of it. So if you believe, based on the data, that's effective in another indication, you're well within your rights to use it for that indication. So there's no problem there. The FDA approved label is actually much more stronger for the manufacturers and pharmaceutical companies. They're not allowed to advertise for off-label use, but doctors are allowed to use it off-label. The companies just can't advertise. So it's much more of a restriction there. And so you can't get sued. And I always believe that if you practice good medicine based on a good interpretation of the evidence-based and the physiology and the biologic plausibility, you shouldn't worry about getting sued. And so I've been very firmly, I've never doubted my use of ivermectin once I was convinced of the efficacy. The last question I want to answer, which is a problem, is we have been hearing reports of pharmacists who have refused to fill ivermectin because they don't believe it's indicated or they disagree with it. Now, I have to be clear about that. There are a number of states in the country where pharmacists do have the right to not fill a prescription. But I want to be totally clear, this would be a completely inappropriate use of that right, and it should be challenged by any physician. The rights are actually for something that's known to be dangerous, so something that will interact with another medicine and or is in an inappropriate and unsafe dose. So if the pharmacist has specific knowledge as to why a patient shouldn't receive a specific medication, that's fine. If a pharmacist is refusing to fill medicine based on profound ignorance of the evidence base and efficacy, any physician who's hearing this should absolutely challenge that. Do not take that as an answer from any pharmacist. I've already challenged them. I said, listen, I will send you my review manuscript, which covers 32 controlled trials and 6,500 patients, but you are going to fill this prescription. They do not have the right to fill it on that basis just because they're ignorant of a drug. Ignorance does not mean that they can exercise that right. And that's coming from me, and I would challenge that repeatedly and vociferously.
Yeah, and Dr. Kory, so the interesting thing is we've all throughout the day, the event, we've had question after question, how do I get it? And I'll tell everybody my personal experience, and I've been advocating for this within my personal and professional networks for 2 months because I felt 2 months ago that the data was in, started using it for my family. And what we did is, I have a concierge physician. My wife has a separate concierge physician here in Orange County, California. We called, asked them to review the data that the FLCCC was putting out, also to review the peer-reviewed and soon to be published in the next week to 10 days manuscript in a prominent medical journal here based in the U.S., Frontiers in Pharmacology. But the manuscript is already out in its final form. Have them read the 31-page manuscript. And I would encourage all of you to do that. It's available on the website. And, I'm a real estate guy. I read it literally in under an hour. I absorbed at least 96% of the content. It's really a tour through 27 of the controlled trials in countries across the world. And all of my friends and family who have, whether they have a concierge physician or not, those who have provided that documentation, as well as a link to the FLCCC website, every single time the physicians actually read the document and spent some time reviewing the data on the website, they've turned a no initially out of ignorance to a prescription. So then the last thing I'll mention is on the FAQs, which are very powerful. You got to go to the FLCCC.net website, and the FAQs in the second, they're all very powerful. The second question on the FAQs is, what if my physician won't prescribe it? And there's a list globally of telehealth physicians, by the way, growing by the day, that you can call, do an interview with, and they will write scripts both for preventative and treatment if you or a loved one already has the disease. I will, as a public service announcement, I will tell you that my friends and family have done that a lot over the last week and a half to 2 weeks. And because of the high volume, it's taking these doctors 4 or 5 days to get back to you. But we tested it ourselves last week. It was a 4 or 5 day lag period. They called my wife back, and we went through the process. So just a public service announcement there. But the volume and the requests are causing delay. That's it. Dr. Kory, on behalf of YPO internationally and my own chapter that's near and dear to my heart, YPO Southern California Gold, we can't tell you how much we appreciate this high impact information. You guys are making an unbelievable difference, and I am convinced it will be standard of care globally. The question is not if, in my view, it's when, and we need every person on this call with broad and deep centers of influence to help us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Really appreciate it.
Enough.